Everybody. Paul told me I'm here to enhance. I was held up a little bit at the business meeting that was running upstairs. So sorry for this. Thank you for waking up early after a Saturday night out. I hope you had a nice time. I'm confident you're going to have a good time now. Our keynote speaker, I'm conflicted here, is also a really, really dear friend. You're not supposed to invite your friends to do this. But Paul has also been an immense support, a great teacher, a good friend tapping on my shoulder saying, you can do this, you can do this. You have good friends in the audience, and he's always been in the audience for me. He has been doing some really interesting work. This is not the first address that Paul has given to our Congress. He was also, he's past president, so he has given his presidential keynote a few years ago. And in that keynote, Paul wanted to play a song, and things didn't quite work out. So I was hoping that opening up this, we would have played the song, but I don't think he wanted to go there. It was very, for those of you who remember this, it was very traumatic. So I thought, how about I invite Paul to give us a keynote, tell us about the amazing work he has been doing, and give him another chance if he wanted to play a song, which I think he won't be. I also have to tell you that Paul is going to be retiring now. So you are going to be his last academic audience. He's giving other keynotes, so I guess he'll be going elsewhere. But for us here at ISPP, it is important to recognize the achievements of a great academic mind, a fantastic mentor who has served in our mentoring program for so many years, but also a really, really good teacher. And I invite you to join me in learning from Paul on not just understanding concepts of political psychology that are uncertain, but also learning from how to teach other people how to teach them better. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Teresa. I can't promise a song and even less a dance, heaven forfend, at this time of the morning. But Teresa's set us a timely and important focus for our conference: democracy as an achievement. Both the subject itself and the way that she's presented it to us might at first glance appear to be straightforward, but it's anything but. And I think it serves us well to give it some reflection. I don't need to tell you that in the contemporary experience of many of us, democracy has been challenged, called into question, may even be said to be in crisis. But a crisis is always also an opportunity. And we have an opportunity to open up our understandings of democracy. The point I wish to make today is that it's through encouraging a critical and deep opening of the concept of democracy through political psychology that we can best serve our fellow citizens and political communities to open up the practices of democracy. Let's begin briefly with the concept of democracy itself. Democracy is certainly based on the Republican principle of popular sovereignty, but what does that really mean? In the 1960s, Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson proposed a radical questioning of the taken-for-granted assumptions regarding democracy in his book, The Real World of Democracy. He argued that the individualistic Western liberal variant of democracy the standard definition of democracy is not the only one, and that there are also important class-based communist variants, as well as what he referred to at that time as underdeveloped variants of democracy based on egalitarianism and a version of the general will. Well, the regimes and the circumstances of Macpherson's time have elapsed, but the general principle of the plurality of democracies remains. Democracy as the rule or power of the people can be driven in many directions, illustrated, I think, most easily by the three big foundational ideologies. First, liberalism, the reasonable freedom of citizens to independence and privacy, beyond the reach of the state in civil society. This includes freedom of speech, assembly, and the media, the basic political choice of free and fair elections. Second, conservatism, the need for codified and basic structures of discipline, law and order, deference to precedent, and most critically, a constitutional order of guaranteed rights and freedoms, balanced against citizen obligations. And finally, socialism, the broad equality of citizens and acceptance of diversity and political inclusion. And in the context of these and other ideological strands, democracies will always be in both internal and external tension. There's always a plurality of interests and aspirations, balancing freedom with equality and order, as well as expressions of justice. To return to Teresa's expression, democracy as an achievement. It has no tense, I noticed. Are we thinking of a past accomplishment, a future objective, or perhaps even a conditional status? I start from the perspective of all three of these tenses. While far from perfect or complete, democracy in its various guises has indeed been an achievement for many people. And that is why it was the familiar rallying cry of millions fighting for political reforms throughout the 20th century. But democracy is always elusive in meaning, a floating signifier, into which people who aspire to a better political order invest their hopes and dreams for the future, as well as their mythologized recollections of the past. And they work to construct their various histories and build their future visions. Most critically, adopting various histories and strands of what democracy might be or might become, we approach it conditionally. Given its openness as a concept, what might it mean in the construction of rational political arrangements and just societies? Democracy is everywhere in question today, and the meanings of democracy have indeed been prized open in the contemporary world. The details are familiar to us, and I'll just go through them quickly. Widespread eroding confidence in traditional political institutions, declining voter turnout, mediated disinformation, the personalization of politics, and the rise of authoritarian populisms. The central institutions of politics and mainstream political organizations are no longer trusted, and the personalization of political leadership has increasingly led to the alternation of absurd lionization and abject vilification. Decreasing numbers of people are engaging in conventional ways of democratic participation. Political information is increasingly in the hands of extremists and charlatans, whose resources dominate the negative echo chambers of the internet, while mainstream and legacy media become increasingly impoverished and taken over by remote owners, whose economic and political interests lie in prolonging and antagonizing divisions. And into this mix has arisen a new category of populist leaders who claim to be a channel for a singular people against a range of constructed enemies, notably strangers, foreigners, and those labeled the elite. And these populist leaders claim to offer singular truths to a unified people. And in so doing, they of course marginalize other truths and other identities. These actions for them and their followers are sublimely democratic. And this is ironic because at the heart of the very concept of democracy are built-in struggles over meaning. We've known this since 1956, when Walter Gully, in his article, said that democracy has all the characteristics of an essentially contested concept. It is in contention. It's internally complex with a range of meanings inherent in it. Is it a matter of political choice and refusal? Is it more about political equality, political participation, or some combination of these? It's open to interpretation and capture by differing interests, and is used both aggressively and defensively. Importantly, Galley understands that in routine political life, everyday understandings are taken for granted. But he then raises the possibilities of what happens to concepts once they're recognized as in contention and plural in meaning. And I'll just read you a little bit of what he says. I quote here. In what way should we expect current dogfights over the concept of democracy to be affected if its essentially contested character were recognized by all concerned? So long as contestant users of any essentially contested concept believe, however deludedly, that their own use of it is the only one that command honest and informed approval, they're likely to persist in the hope that they will ultimately persuade and convert all their opponents by logical means. But once let the truth out of the bag, i.e., the essential contestedness of the concept in question, then this harmless, if deluded hope may well be replaced by a ruthless decision to cut the cackle, to damn the heretics, and to exterminate the unwanted, unquote. Well, fast forward over 60 years to the current era of populism, global misinformation, and post-truth politics, and the situation is well summarized by Lewandowski, Ecker, and Cook, who point out that people's beliefs are grounded in forms of motivated reasoning and confirmation bias. As they say, we're now facing a situation in which a large share of the populace is living in an epistemic space that has abandoned conventional criteria of evidence, internal consistency, and fact-seeking. An obvious hallmark of a post-truth world is that it empowers people to choose their own reality, where facts and objective evidence are trumped by existing beliefs and prejudices. Democracy, which is an open and plural concept, faces preemptive closure and shutting down, in which little attempt is made to listen to or to understand or take into account alternative perspectives. Social scientists in general and political psychologists in particular are able to draw upon decades of research into democracy that have stressed its openness and plurality, both as a concept and as an observed practice. Given the circumstances of our times, in which the very value and worth of academics and intellectuals has been under attack, it is important to defend the academy and to be champions of political literacy and political socialization to the possibilities of the democratic self. Regarding our public roles as political psychologists, I wrote in 2016, our perspective on the world matters, and we have at least a right, perhaps even a duty, to engage in our political worlds. We have responsibilities as theorists and researchers that are additional to our responsibilities as citizens, which prompt us to engage, to draw inferences from our own research into the arena of public policy, and to speak up about our values, because if we do not, others will gladly fill the vacuum. And since I wrote these words, of course, many indeed have come forward to fill that vacuum. What I have to say about the democratic self today, grounded in my research in political psychology, is what I believe each of us in the public sphere would do well to promote and encourage. And this applies to political leaders, the media, opinion leaders, and public intellectuals, the educational system, workplaces, and other key places of political socialization and acculturation. And as political psychologist Casey Mahendran points out, as we move to a world of more direct democracy through networks of social media and other platforms, so the proportions of those who are available to model and promote democratic practices increases. Well, the core of my message begins in the unlikely setting of the 19th century Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz, whose chapter on military genius in his book On War includes a phrase that's been translated, perhaps a little crudely, as the realm of uncertainty and the fog of war. In my title today, his concept is adapted, thereby addressing the possibilities of democracy as a sphere in which to support and even to celebrate uncertainty, the republic of uncertainty. Substituting republic for realm, we transform von Clausewitz's monarchy into the people's open and active domain. Returning to the very bases of democracy, we ask who constitutes the people and how will they come to agree on common rules and resource distribution. At the heart of these questions are the challenges of political dialogue, agonistic pluralism, the narrative imagination, critical reasoning, and political empathy. Moving away from the fixed certainties, combative positionalities, and clear-cut decisions of politics as a martial art, we consider the importance of uncertainty, suspended judgment and decision, tolerance of ambiguity, open listening, and the admission of confusion and ignorance in the muddy formation of the democratic self. These practices, I think, are remarkably captured in the wise counsel of Manuel Castells, who concludes his 2019 book on democracy, Rupture, with these words: "I've observed many different societies over the last 2 decades, and despite appearances, I've not detected many signs of new democratic life. Given that the destruction of one state to create another may lead to terror, as we learned in the 20th century, we could experiment a little and have the historical patience to watch these embryos of freedom planted in our minds through practices, to see how they grow and transform. Maybe not to build a new political order, but rather perhaps to configure a creative chaos in which we learn to flow with life's current instead of forcing it into bureaucracies and programming it into algorithms. Given our historical experience, maybe learning to live in chaos would be less harmful than conforming to the discipline of yet another order." Learning to live in chaos. Well, we might not anticipate such vagueness and imprecision from the leading global scholar of the sociology of communications. But he's definitely onto something. And it is this approach to democracy that I want to briefly reference in the rest of what I have to say today. The work of the global concept of democracy suited to our times is enabled and promoted through taking the time to process, to think, to be confused, to take on board a complex of information and viewpoints, to be uncertain, and to live in doubt for a while, to avoid rushing to judgment or conclusion. I want to briefly present 4 interrelated concepts that derive from political psychology and develop different facets of the importance of living with chaos, doubt, uncertainty, and indecision. These are critical reasoning, tolerance of ambiguity, the dialogical self, and thoughtfulness. Start with critical reasoning. The Enlightenment project, which is the basis of Western scientific reasoning, is grounded in principles of skepticism, doubt, and rational explanation, briefly illustrated by John Stuart Mill, who identifies the critical importance of freedom of thought, expression, and dialogue. In his essay on liberty, one of my favorite passages is where he says, "However unwillingly a person who has a strong opinion may admit the possibility that his opinion may be false, he ought to be moved by the consideration that however true it may be, if it is not fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth." The generally accepted principles that underpin Mill's views on political deliberation are those of critical reasoning, tolerance, openness to alternative perspectives, imagination, and sustained dialogue. Among contemporary theorists, a major development in critical reasoning is the recognition and importance of doubt. And this is developed by Ulrich Beck, who says, "Knowledge arises not from the affirmation of knowledge, which blithely continues to be true, but only from a love of doubt, which does not let anything stand as valid. Doubt is the motive force of science." In terms of the emergence of the democratic self, this does not, however, imply a bland relativism in which one's own values and truths are suspended, anything goes, and little is scrutinized, but rather a studied and purposeful commitment to and a careful promotion of a plurality of perspectives. Beck refers to this quality as perspectivism, and he says, "The introduction of insecurity into our thought and deeds may help to achieve the reduction of objectives, slowness, revisability, and ability to learn, the care, consideration, tolerance, and irony that are necessary for the change to a new modernity." I want to take a little detour into irony, because irony in this context means the self-reflexive and active capability to stand outside one's own biography, formation, and influences, and to be skeptical and distant from what would otherwise be taken for granted, common sense, or banal ways of life. It's a superpower to be able to, like a very wonderful fish, jump outside the water in which one is swimming. Ironic detachment enables the subject to stand back and regard themselves from the perspective of the other. This doesn't mean abandoning the political self or subsuming it, but it does imply recognizing its partiality, contingency, and changeability. Beck's proposing that we live in reflexive doubt, and he's critical of the traditional Enlightenment road of linear doubt, with its impatience with the unknown and its telos of ultimate certainty. To dwell in ambivalence is in fact to avoid the despair of unattainable certainty. To have faith, trust, morality, and knowledge, perhaps, but to avoid the bonds of fixedness and surety that condemns any future doubt, because it can't be readily integrated into the pre-existing dominant paradigm. The dangers of linear doubt are those of essentialism, absolutism, cultural and ideological arrogance, and superiority. Extending Beck's idea on doubt, political psychologist John Cash stresses the centrality of the ego in psychodynamic terms, and thereby extends the concept of ego integrity. Differentiating Beck's concept of reflexive doubt from the Enlightenment tradition of linear doubt, Cash says, Beck is right about the pressing need for the art of doubt and for what I have termed the capacity to dwell in ambivalence. The contemporary world can no longer afford either the hubris of linear doubt or the destructiveness of the friend-enemy distinction, shored up by the certainties of absolutism. My second category is tolerance of ambiguity. In the wake of the Holocaust and the Second World War, a group of exiled German scholars in the United States combined psychological with political theory in an attempt to understand authoritarianism. Their influential studies spanned the analyses of anti-Semitism, ethnocentrism, and prejudice. Of course, we in ISPP know that the authoritarian tradition gave birth to such a rich tradition that's included scholars in the memories of many of us and here present today, people such as John Duckett, Sam McFarland, and Stanley Feldman. But it was Michael Binford in 1983 who pointed out that democratic political personality has been far less analyzed than the authoritarian personality, and that therefore much of what we can say about the democratic personality is in fact negatively defined, the opposite of the much greater scrutinized authoritarian scales. Notable exceptions are to be found among the earliest contributors to political psychology, Harold Lasswell and Robert Lane, who characterized the democratic personality as having, quote, ego strength, flexibility, tolerance, and more developed cognitive abilities. Well, returning to the authoritarian personality, among the more interesting findings were those focused on people who scored low on the various authoritarian scales. These anti-authoritarians therefore scored high on two dimensions, tolerance of ambiguity and introception. Introception meaning support for the imagination, for creativity, empathy, and self-criticism. These were democratic qualities disavowed by authoritarians. In the authoritarian personality, those scoring low on ethnic prejudice questionnaire scale were found to be more flexible, tolerant of ambiguity, and introceptive. The authors wrote, low scorers on ethnic prejudice tend toward greater flexibility and acceptance of ambiguity. There is, in the records of low scorers, a tendency to use a great deal of qualifying phrases and other devices characteristic of an approach that is judicious rather than prejudicial through dogma, convention, or a fixed set. There seems to be a general tendency on the part of low scorers to expose themselves to broad experience, emotional, cognitive, perceptual, even at the risk of having to modify one's preconceived notions or having to sustain conflicts. Unquote. Well, these psychological characteristics of flexibility, tolerance of ambiguity, and introception render the political self open to others and curious regarding the worlds of political values and beliefs. Importantly, they reflect an emotional preparedness to accept the otherness of others and to care that those perspectives are taken into account in the building of democratic societies. Thirdly, the dialogical self. The way in which the evolving political self navigates and integrates doubt and uncertainty is through dialogue, distinguishable from discussion, which, as the name implies, is concussive and combative, and where exchanges consist largely of the assertion of counterposing or competing ideas, the clashing of ideas. Dialogue is a mode of engagement in which a range of ideas and persons are deliberately and carefully taken into account in a process of exchange, and in which subjects are open to listening, reflection, and change. Dialogical self-theory explains self and society as part of a continuum in which the mind is itself a society, and the dynamics of social movements and social structures are operative within the subject. This means the capacity to take the position of the other, developing beyond the subject-object dualisms of symbolic interactionism. Dialogical self-theory offers an open and dialectical model of the emergence of the self. In his 2018 book on democracy, Hubert Hermans describes the encounters that take place through the integration and operation of what he refers to as I positions, which are derived from societies, institutions, families, and a range of social sources, and then sorted, contrasted, assessed, and argued over in the context of the emerging self. Going beyond the blunt imposition of perspectives or the generation of meaning in an isolated and fixed mind, the dialogical process is open to a range of alternative and possible positions, both between people and within them. The basis for the development of the dialogical self is trust. And Hermans writes, I quote here from Hermans, "The transition from debate to dialogue demands that one is willing to leave a situation in which one's own position is fixed, predictable, and identity-enhancing, to a situation in which one's own position becomes part of a broader complexity of positions that leads, at least temporarily, to a state of uncertainty or even chaos. In order to tolerate such a process, disclosure of one's vulnerability and expressing trust in the possible value of an unpredictable outcome facilitates this transition." Well, in articulating the characteristics of uncertainty as the valued core of the dialogical self, Hermans says, "I consider the experience of uncertainty as extremely valuable for fostering openness to a wider array of possibilities in the future. To live means to face ambiguity and uncertainty. In a life filled with uncertainty and ambiguity, we have to go beyond tolerance and move on to wisdom as a creative and practical way of giving dialogical answers. Suspension of judgment and non-judgmental listening are some of the most challenging skills in dialogical learning." For democracy to flourish, participants need to identify common I positions, to identify mutual understanding, and also be prepared to work on areas of misunderstanding and incomprehension in an atmosphere of uncertainty. As Hermans says, going beyond tolerance of ambiguity, he advocates for an embrace of ambiguity, to live and to work deeply within it in order to learn, adapt, and to develop. He develops 4 key concepts of the experience of uncertainty: complexity, ambiguity, knowledge deficits, and low predictability. And he concludes with these words, which I've got on the screen for you. "Given the multiplicity and diversity of different, contrasting, or conflicting perspectives that in their confrontation influence each other and are subjected to continuous change, it should be concluded that uncertainty is at the heart of democracy. My final concept is thoughtfulness. Engagement in the political world is at the heart of a range of theoretical perspectives that stress the centrality of openness. Hannah Arendt refers to this as the concept of thoughtfulness and stresses the importance of critical thinking and action as ways of being in the world. The basis for Arendt's political philosophy is the societal fact of plurality. This means diversity among the cultures, values, and ideals of humanity, and its recognition stands in sharp contradistinction to tyranny. Practically speaking, politics happens at the confluence of many people's creativity and imagination, thoughts and intentions. To live and contribute to this plurality is the work of human action, the most creative and innovative aspect of human activity in the human condition. And the chief obstacle to action is thoughtlessness, the abandonment of the plurality of the human world. To be without action is to be, quote, entirely private, deprived of seeing and hearing others, of being seen and being heard by them. They are all imprisoned in the subjectivity of their own singular experience. How do we actualize the habits of openness, tolerance, dialogue, and thoughtfulness? Martha Nussbaum places her emphasis on cultivating a sympathetic imagination that allows us to be able to open ourselves to the lives and needs of others different from ourselves. She advocates the development and growth of the narrative imagination, and in so doing, points to the critical importance of the arts and literature in the formation of the developing human mind. How important it is that our children have drama and fine art in their schools if we want them to be democrats. Political psychologist Molly Andrews extends this work in her book, Narrative Imagination and Everyday Life. Stressing the recognition of our common vulnerability and the need for compassion, Nussbaum says, narrative art has the power to make us see the lives of the different with more than a casual tourist's interest, with involvement and sympathetic understanding, with anger at our society's refusals of visibility. Narrative imagination is an essential preparation for moral interaction. Through the narrative imagination, we develop the capacity to empathetically and creatively share in the lives of those who are remote from us in culture, geography, and experience. As she says, quote, to allow inside one's mind people who seem alien and frightening is to show a capacity for openness and responsiveness that goes against the grain of many cultural stereotypes of self-sufficiency. I'm going to conclude. You might be thinking that what I have to propose about the cultivation of the democratic self is all very well and nice in theory, but it's far away from where we are at the moment and not particularly realistic. And despite their undoubted contributions and richness, many of us do understand the limitations of the theories that I've been discussing, and added to that, contact theory, Habermasian communicative action, models of democratic deliberation. You know, that's our business, isn't it, to criticize these. So I'm not going to entirely disagree with you. In fact, I agree with the many observers who believe that democracy, however we conceive it, is in a bad way, in balance, in jeopardy, in crisis. Ignorance, mutual indifference, thoughtlessness, selfishness, and unkindness have all taken a long time to cultivate. And so trying to instill habits of thinking and being in the world that counter them will also take a great deal of patience, effort, and will to implement. and this necessitates structural, cultural, institutional, and other changes that go way beyond what I've been talking about. Well, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and the evidence is that politics does work better with positive engagement rather than estrangement, enmity, absolutism, essentialism, and the retreat into silos. That was the thesis of a book that Katerina Schinwald and I put together a few years ago. In setting out the ideal characteristics of a politics of engagement that values reflexivity, critical appraisal, dialogue, tolerance, and thoughtfulness, we do need to be realistic, and it bears pointing out that the conditions for such interactions are not always possible or even desirable. As Katerina Schinwald and I have argued before, to everything there is a season. There are, of course, going to be times and places when dialogue is ill-advised or impossible, when contact makes matters worse, when the pain or anger of past injustices is just too raw, when there is an exceptional and continued asymmetry in power, when people with no sincere intention to engage in dialogue become leaders and representatives, when words will not express what's needed, and when, despite the best efforts, there's no adequate basis for communication. Under these circumstances, deep listening, consideration, openness, and critical reasoning are neither immediately possible nor even necessarily desirable. There are those who are not ready to speak, those who lack access to the dominant discourses in which talk occurs. Some discourses are indeed more equal than others. Others may not be invited. And there are those who have become so used to shunning, not being heard, that they no longer wish to engage. We further confront deeper challenges that our very discourses may be mutually incomprehensible, that our rationalities are different. There may be no adequate way to assess the moral or rational status of competing claims, the familiar problem of relativism. We can also accept that there are occasions when the inchoate cry of anger or rage must simply be accepted. Moreover, silences must be respected and appreciated as eloquence and plenitude. Silences don't always signify assent, and they may in fact be highly active, working silences. Many of us are familiar with the ways in which power can operate as non-decision, and how power can operate ideologically as a way of defining things out of the world of possibility. Those, especially with little power, may choose to exercise their choices through the safe tools that they have available to them beneath the radar: resistance between the cracks, humor, the vernacular, song, Teresa, symbolic expressions with those who share the code, the poetry, or the rhetoric. All these qualifiers are valid and reasonable. However, when war is over, or the tyrant has fallen, and the streets are empty, what do we do then? We need to re-engage, pick ourselves up in the daily and routine arts of politics, and figure out how we, in our astounding diversity and plurality, are going to make common rules together and share the resources. In other words, we need to do democracy. This means we need to talk. And before that, we need to listen. And before that, we need to think. And before that, we need to trust. And before that, we need to care. Thank you. Do we have some time for questions, Teresa? How long do we have? About 15 minutes, says Teresa, if anybody does have any questions. And I think people have been asked to go to the microphone, haven't they, if they have questions. Thank you. I think we've got a microphone here and a microphone there. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I guess I will start. Thank you very much, Paul, for a very interesting talk, and one that I'm very in tune with and support very much. At the end, you've answered some of the questions that might come up from people, and ones that I've heard in critiques myself. But there's one that you didn't address that I'd like to ask you about. We know that people get motivated to act when they have a sense of righteousness, a sense of surety, a sense of this is what justice is, and so we have to pursue this. And that when they face the kinds of things that you have put forward as necessary for a democratic personality, things like ambiguity, uncertainty, that they tend to be more apathetic. They tend to lose the motivation. And in fact, that some of the problems we see in democracy now may be arising from that. The very people that have the democratic personality that you describe have become disgusted with politics and so withdraw. So how do you respond to the concerns that maybe if you're right, that in fact democracy is impossible? Because we need to be uncertain or ambiguous or be able to live with that, but that undercuts the very motivations for people to spend time on that rather than other things that are important to them. I hope that makes sense, yeah?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And this is something that I did address briefly towards the end, and I absolutely agree with you that there are people for whom, I mean, there's two different issues that I picked up on in what you were saying. One was that there are people who have a sort of fairly pre-existing set of ideas that it's very difficult for them to open up in certain ways to others. And then there are others who, in a secondary sense, are so disillusioned with the process that they don't really want to get involved anymore. And so, yeah, I think a lot of this is, is just basically a long slog and a practice to try to encourage and help people to understand how it is that you take ideas and work with them dialogically, that you open yourselves to the imagination of the other. I mentioned socialization. I think that's education and socialization are critical in my mind, and they're long-term cultivation effects rather than instant solutions. And boy, if we had the answer to the, how you take the people who are the most stuck in the ways that you describe and transform their lives with allowing for the intergenerational transmission of that kind of thing, we'd have, some miraculous answers. I don't think there are any. So, as I said, it's just a matter of, I think, in my point of view, persisting and continuing to model leadership is incredibly important. Leadership can make a big difference because here's the kernel of hope. Sometimes when people see what can happen through play, through the openness to the other, through the pleasures of social encounter, they can in fact move very much in that direction because it's pleasurable. It has its own pleasure. So there are some immediate reflections, but it's something that I will continue to think about.
Thank you for this very thoughtful approach, Paul. I have a little bit of an unformed question, which is, I'm trying to unpack a little bit the notion of uncertainty, because so often in our work, we think of uncertainty as something negative that we have to avoid. There is an affect attached to uncertainty that usually is assumed to be negative. But uncertainty can be positive too, or neutral. Uncertainty as a cognitive state does not have to have a negative affective tag on it. There's a positive uncertainty that comes with hope and expectation, or the uncertainty of not receiving negative news for those of us who had health challenges. The uncertainty of not knowing can be positive sometimes rather than knowing. And it can be neutral when it is associated with just lack of knowledge. You can just be uncertain. But uncertainty often is assumed as a negative, as I said at the beginning. And the challenge there is, how do you hold on to that negative uncertainty, the ambivalence of the potential positive uncertainty plus the negative uncertainty that coexists in situations where you cannot predict. And you mentioned trust a little, so I just wanted to ask what you think there. Very, very often when we think about trust, we think about positive certainty, the positive certainty that trust gives us. And I'm increasingly thinking that trust is about recognizing and holding the negative uncertainty and relying on interpersonal relations to get you help go through this, but maintaining this. So I wanted to invite your thoughts on that, because I think it is linked, the affect of uncertainty and how it links to trust. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Teresa, for a very important question. And let me just address the last part question on trust, because I think I agree with you immediately that inherent in trust, in the way that I'm thinking about it, is an acceptance of the virtues of uncertainty. Because it really does mean, you know, taking, I mean, this is rather, I mean, I don't want to get theological, but it does have kind of theological roots, that trust of that kind is the basis of a lot of world religions, that you take the existence of other people and their lives and the way that they're living those lives as an open and wondrous thing, and that you stand in a kind of position of openness toward them, and that itself constitutes trust. As for how you get people to identify with this and to practice, I think, you know, again, I think a lot of it is to do with taking some of the tendencies and characteristics, say, of contemporary global living, the speed, the rapidity, the inequality, the materialism, the quick decision-making, the sometimes very cheap way that human lives are considered in this, and you consciously attempt to reverse all those things. I mean, in terms of that's what you do. In other words, if one of the problems with people not thinking about how to work with uncertainty is speed and materialism, you slow things down and you decommodify things. And you have to look for practices that will encourage those things. And you know, a lot of that happens, you know, in some of the spheres that I'm talking about: the sphere of play, the sphere of theatre, the sphere of childcare, and the care that communities give each other in the practices that they develop. So, interestingly enough, I think some of those things had a bit of a kernel of hope in the COVID era, when we talk about the way the communities came back together again. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to go ahead? Thank you for that very beautiful response. I think those multiple spheres is a great idea. But as a political psychologist, I guess I'm also wondering about, can that actually act as an inoculation against the type of populist identity politics that we know can, if you have uncertainty, the self-categorization model says, boom, some identity entrepreneur can immediately
put in place an exclusionary identity, and then you put that uncertainty into a group form and you blame the outgroup. It's the simple solution. And everything you're talking about is the deeper wisdom that humanity has, but frequently does not make use of. And so I guess my question is for more of these institutional inoculations, how do we can inoculate ourselves against it, but then we'll be like 50 people and then 500,000 people will vote in the opposite direction. So something about politics and how do you deal with that inoculation of the uncertainty and then the rejection type of intergroup politics? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for that really important question. And I mean, it's obviously something that has been on my mind as I've put this together. And again, I don't think there are any easy answers, but what I would say is, you talked about entrepreneurship of identity. You do get populist entrepreneurs, but I think what I'm calling for in terms of leadership is alternative forms of leader, and they're out there too. Those that actually would promote this kind of thinking and reasoning and openness. And I do believe that we have those kinds of leaders in the world. And I think, the answer is the sublime art of politics, that you get behind and you organize behind those kinds of leaders because they represent an agenda that you know is going to be positive, and you hope that you achieve political gain in that respect through agonistic work in the political sphere. And that is a slow and difficult process, and it works at many different levels. I'm really struck, for example, just to give one example, by our Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who I think does model, for all his faults, and I don't want to get into whether Trudeau's, a good or bad leader, but I think for all his faults, he does model this kind of leadership in many ways. What was he doing last week? He was leading a group of school children through a wood and talking to them about nature. That's what our political leaders should be doing, I believe, much more. And that kind of modeling has concatenation effects that I think are very, very important. Thank you.
That was a beautiful talk. Thank you so much. I want to just propose a thought to see that I see that's not in your, at least in the paper, but I'll ask you if it's compatible. It might address kind of Teresa's question. So I get this idea from Ben Barber in his book, Strong Democracy, 1984. He talks about what politics is. Politics is the situation in which people need to do something, but there's no agreement. There's lots of different views. There's no authority that they can all rush to and go, oh, that's what we do, right? Yeah. So each individual may be really certain about this is the right thing to do, but they also realize that other people have a different view, and they cannot just batter the other person over the head to get them to come around to my view. My book says this. As they say, well, I don't like your book. So it's not so much uncertainty, though I think that's a good virtue that you point to, that Mill has, but it's understanding there's disagreement and no authority. There's no authority to turn to. So, for example, if there's a busy intersection and people are dying there there might be a lot of agreement, put a traffic light there, and it doesn't become a political issue because people agree, right? So, but when there's whether we should put money into building a new hospital or what, then when there's disagreement, it becomes political. So it seems like what's missing, kind of that would fit in with what you're talking about, is that it's not just a nice virtue, but it's actually inherently, it's a part of understanding what politics is. Politics arises because there's disagreement. If there's agreement and certainty, it's not political at all. So I think it seems like we need to have the task of those of us who think about this is to convey that it's the nature of politics to decide in the midst of uncertainty.
Noel, thank you for your comments. I've made notes, and I agree. This was not a presentation about argument. it was about uncertainty, but behind it is the premise that there are different ways of arguing. And I think you mentioned that hitting people over the head with the metaphor, but it also can be literal, hitting people over the head. The great thing, I think, from my perspective about uncertainty and living in uncertainty is that you open that chink of doubt, of wonder, of curiosity, of affective openness, of theoretical uncertainty, which permits you at the very least to see the possibility of others, and therefore I think probably results in the end in better syntheses of decision-making that come about. But I'm sorry, was it the reference I didn't quite hear? Oh yeah, right, okay, yeah, good, I've got that, thank you. I see some other hands. How much time do we have?
We have just about over, maybe a couple of minutes.
Perhaps we'll have one more question? Thank you very much.
For a minute comment, thank you. I'm a cognitive psychologist who has gotten recently into political psychology because of everything that we see. There are several fields of study, subfields, that political psychologists can understand much more about. Uncertainty is linked to conformity. Therefore, the various political strategists have tried this and succeeded very well in making people uncertain about from anything from vaccines to everything else so that they can conform. Weren't you in Rome? Do as the Romans do. That's exactly what it means. It's much easier to conform when people are uncertain. And I hope very much that the subsequent ideas of topics of political psychology will focus on these neurocognitive basics, such as these. Also, I very much wish that the people who are here and who do, their dissertations delve more into the political strategies of using the research on emotion, on the ventral tegmental area, on the conformity, on the de-individuation, on the coming together, particularly of males, to where judgment falls behind, since other animals do that very well, on the evolutionary aspects. And of course, the uncertainty is one of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contributions. I certainly will be following up by looking at that link between the uncertainty and conformity. Thank you for that. At this stage, I'd just like to say that I'm easy to find on email, and if anybody has any questions or would like a copy of the comments I made today, I'd be very happy to send them to you. So thank you again very much. Thank you, Teresa.
I was not going to come up here again and say that, but I am, because Paul is really easy to find. You can find him at 2 o'clock at the Presidential Roundtable, Uncertainty as an Achievement, where he, together with Nicholas and Noel, are going to be joined by Stanley Feldman and Gulnaz, I don't know if she's here, and Barry Richards, who's going to be joining us from Zoom, and Mikko Salmela, who I think is there, where we are going to be discussing all these things that we have been trying to come to terms with. Perhaps the answer to all this is oscillation between uncertainty and certainty, right? But thank you.